The movie made them look cool. That's the first thing you need to understand before we go anywhere. Before we talk about Texas, before we talk about the Depression, before we talk about stolen cars and cold beans and 130 bullets on a Louisiana back road, you need to understand what the movie did to your brain. Because the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, is one of the most beautifully constructed lies ever put on a cinema screen. And it worked. God, it worked perfectly. It worked so well that 60 years later, people still think of Bonnie and Clyde as romantic heroes, as rebels, as glamorous outlaws who lived fast, loved hard, and died tragically together in a hail of cinematic slow-motion bullets. The movie won 2 Academy Awards. It is taught in film schools. It changed Hollywood forever. It launched careers. It created an entire genre of the sympathetic criminal. And it is almost completely wrong about the 2 real human beings whose names it used. Warren Beatty was 30 years old when he played Clyde Barrow. He was handsome, charismatic, one of the most charming actors alive. Faye Dunaway was 26, playing Bonnie Parker in perfectly tailored 1930s costumes with her iconic beret and her cheekbones and her fire. They looked like movie stars because they were movie stars. They were beautiful. They were exciting. They made crime look like the greatest adventure 2 people could ever go on together. They made the Depression look like a backdrop for a love story. They made murder look like an inconvenient side effect of living free. And none of it was true. The real Clyde Barrow was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed about 130 pounds. He was wiry, intense, and deeply traumatized from what happened to him in prison. He smelled bad because he lived in a stolen car for 2 years and rarely had access to a shower. He ate cold beans from cans because cooking over a fire was too dangerous. The smoke could be seen for miles. He killed at least 9 police officers, not in exciting gunfights, but sometimes by shooting them in the back as they tried to run away. He killed a 60-year-old grocery store owner for $28. He murdered 2 young highway patrolmen on Easter Sunday morning in 1934. One of them was 22 years old, brand new on the job, shot to death before he even had a chance to understand what was happening. The real Bonnie Parker was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She weighed under 90 pounds. She was tiny. She was actually genuinely pretty. She had red blonde hair and striking features, and she knew how to present herself. But she was malnourished, exhausted, and from 1933 onward, she was in constant physical agony from third-degree burns covering her entire right leg from a car accident that happened when Clyde drove off a bridge in the middle of the night. The burns never healed properly. They lived in dirty cars. The wound got infected repeatedly. By the last months of her life, Bonnie Parker could barely walk. Clyde had to carry her. She was 23 years old. She was 23 years old, weighed 85 pounds soaking wet, couldn't walk without pain, hadn't had a proper bath in weeks, was eating cold food from tin cans, hadn't seen her mother in months, and had been present for the murders of over a dozen human beings. She had written poetry, actual poetry, dark and sad and prophetic, about how she knew she was going to die young. She had accepted it. That's not romance. That's tragedy. That's a young woman who made a terrible choice at 19 years old and spent 4 years paying for it with everything she had. They weren't Robin Hood. This is the myth that needs to die fastest. They never gave a single dollar to a poor family. They never robbed the rich to feed the hungry. The biggest single robbery the Barrow Gang ever pulled off netted $1,500. That was the jackpot, the best they ever did. Most of their robberies brought in $30 to $150. They robbed gas stations. They robbed small grocery stores owned by poor people, working people, people just like the ones Bonnie and Clyde had grown up around. They robbed a store and killed the owner for $28. They kept every single penny they ever took. Every single cent. There was no generous outlaw giving money to Depression families. That never happened. Not once. The FBI files are clear. The witness testimony is clear. They stole to survive, and they killed anyone who got in their way. And then on May 23, 1934, it ended. A rural back road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Highway 154, near a small place called Sales. 6 lawmen hidden in the bushes on both sides of the road. A stolen tan Ford the 5th 8 coming around a bend at normal highway speed. Frank Hamer, a 50-year-old Texas Ranger, legendary, patient, relentless, stepped out of the brush. He may have shouted something. It doesn't matter because the next 15 to 20 seconds are what everyone remembers. 130 bullets. Some accounts say more. Automatic rifles, shotguns, pistols, all firing at once, all firing continuously, all firing into a car with 2 people in it who had absolutely no chance of survival. Bonnie Parker was hit 26 times. Clyde Barrow was hit at least 25 times. The car looked like it had been fed through a machine designed to punch holes. The windows were gone. The doors were gone. The interior was destroyed. Both of them died instantly, probably in the first seconds, but the officers kept firing because no one was sure, and because these were cop killers, and because everyone who had spent months hunting them was done being careful. Bonnie Parker was 23 years old. Clyde Barrow was 25 years old. They had been on the run together for roughly 4 years. They had killed at least 13 people. And when the news spread, which happened within hours because this was 1934 and telegraphs were fast, 20,000 people showed up to see the bodies. 20,000 people descended on the small town of Arcadia, Louisiana, where the bodies were being held in the back of a furniture store that was serving as a makeshift morgue. And these people, many of them, were not there to mourn. They were there for souvenirs. People tried to cut locks of Bonnie's hair. Someone attempted to cut off Clyde's ear. The undertakers had to physically guard the bodies to prevent them from being mutilated by a crowd of morbid spectators. That's the real story. Not Warren Beatty looking soulfully into the middle distance. Not Faye Dunaway in her beret. Not slow-motion poetry with a beautiful musical score. 2 kids from the Dallas slums. 2 desperately poor young people who had no education, no prospects, no hope, and who made a series of choices that led them from petty theft to murder to a car riddled with bullets on a Louisiana back road before either of them was old enough to rent a car legally in most states today. You've seen the movie. You know the myth. And what I found is a story that is both sadder and darker and more complicated and more human than anything the 1967 movie gave you. This is the complete, true story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Before we go anywhere, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I genuinely want to know how far the myth of Bonnie and Clyde has traveled, because that's part of what we're talking about today. A myth that started with some photographs accidentally left behind in a Missouri apartment in 1933 and grew into a global legend. Tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe because this video is part of a series I've been building, the real stories behind famous crime movies. We did Escobar. We did Serpico. We did Dillinger. We did Scarface. And now we're doing Bonnie and Clyde. And I'm telling you right now, this one hit me differently. Because these were kids. Because the Depression context is something that most people don't understand unless they really sit with it. Because there's something genuinely heartbreaking underneath all the violence. Like this video right now. That thumbs up tells YouTube this matters. It genuinely helps. Here's what you're about to watch. The complete story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, from childhood poverty in the slums of West Dallas to their violent deaths at 23 and 25 years old in a Louisiana ambush. They're real childhoods, and those childhoods are essential context for everything that comes after. The Great Depression, which you need to understand deeply to understand why any of this happened. They're actual crimes, not robberies, but murders, documented murders with victims who had names and families. The 2-year rampage, the manhunt, the ambush, the aftermath, and then we're going to go through the 1967 movie scene by scene and explain exactly what they got right and exactly what they got gloriously, romantically, beautifully wrong. This is not a love story. Despite everything Hollywood told you, despite the posters, despite the berets, despite Warren Beatty's smile. This is a story about what poverty and trauma and desperation can do to 2 young people. It's a story about choices, about violence and its consequences, about the gap between myth and reality. Let's begin. West Dallas, Texas, 1910. The slums that created Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. To understand Bonnie Parker, you need to understand West Dallas in 1910, and to understand West Dallas in 1910, you need to understand what being poor in Texas in the early 20th century actually meant. And I mean really understand it, not the sanitized version, not the sepia-tone nostalgia version you see in period films where everyone is dusty but wholesome. The real version. Because the real version is important. West Dallas was not a neighborhood in the sense that you think of a neighborhood today. It was not a community with parks and corner stores and a sense of shared identity. West Dallas in 1910 was a collection of shacks. Literal shacks, built from whatever materials people could find, set on unpaved dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained and to dust when it didn't. There was no running water in most of these structures. There were outhouses. There was no electricity for most families. The houses, if you could call them houses, were cramped and hot in summer and cold in winter, and the winters in Dallas could be genuinely brutal. Families lived crowded together in single rooms. Children slept several to a bed, or on the floor, or on pallets stuffed with rags. The people who lived in West Dallas were not lazy. That's the most important thing to understand about them, because there's always a tendency, then and now, to look at poor people and assume the poverty is their fault. The people of West Dallas were working. They were working constantly. They were doing backbreaking labor for wages that were barely enough to keep them alive. Fathers worked construction, worked farms, worked loading docks, worked any job they could find for whatever a man with no education or connections could get paid in 1910 Texas. Mothers took in laundry, sewed clothes, cleaned houses for wealthier families across the Trinity River. Children started working as soon as they were old enough to be useful. And it still wasn't enough. It was never enough. This is where Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born. Not in West Dallas, but nearby, in a small town called Rowena, Texas, on October 1st, 1910. Her father, Charles Parker, was a bricklayer. Her mother, Emma, was a sharp, capable, determined woman who would outlive her daughter and spend decades trying to reconcile what her little girl had become with the child she remembered. Bonnie had an older brother named Hubert, everyone called him Buster, and a younger sister named Billy. The family was poor in that baseline way that working-class families of the era were poor, but they had something that made them different from true destitution. They were respectable. Charles Parker worked steadily. He paid his bills. He kept the family together. They were not rich, not even close, but they were not desperate. And then Bonnie was 4 years old and Charles Parker died. Just like that. Just like so many stories from this era begin. A man dies young, it doesn't matter exactly what from, illness probably, because working-class men in early 20th century Texas did not have great access to medical care and died from things that today would be treated with a prescription, and suddenly the entire structure of a family collapses. Emma Parker was a widow at a young age with 3 children under 10 and almost no money. And she made the only decision available to her. She packed up her children and moved to West Dallas, where her parents lived, where there was at least family nearby, where the rent was low enough that a seamstress earning a few dollars a week might be able to keep her children fed and housed. West Dallas. The shacks, the dirt roads, the outhouses, the smell of poverty that is its own specific smell, the combination of too many people in too small a space, coal smoke and cooking grease and unwashed bodies, and the particular desperation of people who are always one bad week away from having nothing at all. Bonnie grew up in this. She was 4 years old when her father died and her world contracted to the streets of West Dallas. And here is the remarkable thing, the thing that makes Bonnie Parker so fascinating and so heartbreaking in equal measure. She refused to let it define her. Not in the way you'd expect. She didn't become sullen or angry or withdrawn the way poverty can make children. She went the other direction. She went loud, bright, outward. She became the most vivid person in any room she walked into. Even as a small child, Bonnie Parker was a performer. Her teachers remembered her. Her classmates remembered her. She was the girl who would stand up in front of the class and recite poems with total commitment and zero self-consciousness. She was the girl who organized the other kids in the neighborhood into little plays and theatrical performances and declared herself the star. She had red blonde hair, unusual, striking, and huge, expressive eyes, and even before she was a teenager she knew how to use her appearance, how to present herself, how to make people look at her. She was also genuinely smart. This is something the 1967 movie completely missed. The movie treats Bonnie as mostly decorative, beautiful, excited, along for the ride. The real Bonnie Parker was intellectually alive in a way that the circumstances of her life had no business producing. She read constantly. Not comic books, not dime novels, though she probably read those too. She read actual literature, actual poetry, actual serious books. She wrote constantly. She kept journals. She wrote poetry from a young age, real poetry with meter and rhythm and emotional depth, and some of it is genuinely remarkable when you consider she was a girl from the West Dallas slums with no formal literary education to speak of. Her teachers repeatedly noted that she was one of the brightest students they'd encountered. What did Bonnie Parker want? She wanted to be famous. She wanted to be an actress or a singer or a writer or all three. She wanted to be someone. She wanted to escape West Dallas not just physically but in every sense. She wanted a life that was bigger and brighter and more important than the life that poverty had mapped out for her. She had the talent. She had the ambition. She had the presence. What she didn't have was money, connections, or the kind of luck that transforms raw talent into actual opportunity. In a different life, in different circumstances, she might have made it. There's a real version of events where Bonnie Parker becomes a singer or an actress or a published poet and lives a long and interesting life. That version didn't happen, but it could have. That's important. By the time she was a teenager, Bonnie was working as a waitress in Dallas cafes. The work was hard and the pay was bad and she was run off her feet every shift, but she was good at it because she was good with people, charming, quick, funny, and she got good tips. She was saving money slowly with some vague idea of eventually doing something with her talent, though the specifics were never quite clear even to her. And then, at 15 years old, she made the first of her terrible decisions. His name was Roy Thornton. He was 16. They were classmates, and by the standards of West Dallas in 1926, a 15-year-old girl marrying was not particularly unusual. Girls from poor families often married young, because marriage was one of the limited routes available to them for improving their circumstances. Roy Thornton was not an improvement. He was handsome enough and charming enough that Bonnie was attracted to him, but he was already showing the signs of the man he was going to become: lazy, dishonest, prone to getting into trouble with the law. He was a petty criminal in embryo. He stole things. He got arrested. He got out of jail and stole more things. The marriage was a disaster almost from the beginning. Bonnie got a tattoo on her inner thigh, Roy and Bonnie, which is both a very Bonnie thing to do and also a very sad detail when you consider that she wore that tattoo for the rest of her life, even after Roy was long gone, even after she'd met Clyde, even as she lay dead in a car on a Louisiana highway. She never had it removed. Make of that what you will. Roy Thornton spent most of their marriage in and out of county jail. The arrests were for petty stuff, theft, burglary, the small-time crimes of a man with no ambition and no brakes. Bonnie was increasingly alone, increasingly bored, increasingly frustrated that this life she was living, waitressing in Dallas cafes, going home to an empty house or to her mother's house, waiting for a husband who was either in jail or out getting ready to go back, was not the life she'd imagined. She was 18, 19, and she felt trapped. She felt like the walls of West Dallas were closing in on her, and there was nothing she could do about it. In 1929, Roy Thornton was sentenced to 5 years in prison for robbery. Not county jail this time, actual state prison. He was going away. And Bonnie Parker, 18 years old, legally married to a man in prison, moved back to her mother's house and tried to figure out what came next. She was still technically married. She had no grounds for divorce, or rather, divorce was expensive and complicated and she couldn't afford it. She was just stuck. Young, pretty, smart, talented, and completely stuck. She was lonely. This is the part people skip when they talk about Bonnie Parker, because loneliness doesn't fit the romantic outlaw narrative. But Bonnie was desperately, achingly lonely. She missed connection. She missed excitement. She missed feeling like her life meant something, like she was going somewhere, like she was more than just another West Dallas girl who married wrong and ended up back where she started. And then, in January of 1930, she met Clyde Barrow. Now we need to talk about Clyde. And to talk about Clyde, we need to go back even further than Bonnie, because Clyde's story is in some ways more brutal from the very beginning. If Bonnie's childhood was marked by the tragedy of a father's early death and the slow grinding misery of respectable poverty, Clyde's childhood was something else entirely. Clyde's childhood was shaped by a depth of destitution that most people in comfortable circumstances genuinely cannot imagine. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, in a small town called Tellico, Texas, in Ellis County. He was the sixth of 7 children born to Henry and Cumie Barrow. Henry Barrow was a sharecropper, And the word sharecropper needs explanation here because it's a term that's been flattened into a historical abstraction, stripped of its specific economic brutality. Sharecropping was not farming. Or rather, it was farming in the same way that indentured servitude was employment. A sharecropper worked land that belonged to someone else. In exchange, they received a share of the crops they grew, typically somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, though the exact split was set by the landowner and was rarely negotiable. The landowner provided the land, sometimes the tools, sometimes the seed, and charged the sharecropper for all of it. The sharecropper provided the labor. The labor was the only thing the sharecropper actually owned. The mathematical reality of sharecropping was that it was almost impossible to get ahead. By the time the landowner took his share, by the time the costs of the tools and the seed and whatever the sharecropper owed from the previous season were deducted, by the time everything was accounted for, most sharecropping families ended each season in debt. Literally in debt to the landowner, which meant they had to stay, work another season, try again, and usually end that season in debt too. It was a system designed, not accidentally, not through carelessness, to keep poor people poor. Henry Barrow was not a bad man. He was a man working as hard as he knew how in a system that was designed to consume men like him. He moved his family constantly, from farm to farm, as leases fell apart or landlords decided they needed the land back or the soil played out or the crops failed. The Barrow children grew up in a state of constant upheaval, never in one place long enough to form deep roots, never stable enough to build the kind of childhood that produces secure adults. There were years when the family was not just poor but genuinely homeless, sleeping in a tent, sleeping under their wagon, moving down roads with everything they owned piled in a cart. By 1922, when Clyde was 13, Henry Barrow had given up on farming. The family had failed too many times, moved too many times, gone hungry too many times. He loaded his family into their wagon and drove to Dallas, specifically to West Dallas, the same slums where Emma Parker had moved her children a decade earlier. The same shacks, the same dirt roads, the same outhouses, the same poverty wearing a different family's name. The Barrow family ended up living under a viaduct, literally under a bridge, in a shack they built themselves from scavenged materials. No running water, no electricity, the sounds of Dallas above them, the traffic and the commerce of a city that wanted nothing to do with the people living underneath it. Henry eventually scraped together enough money to open a small gas station, a tiny operation, barely more than a shed with a pump, and this became the Barrow family's economic base. It was not much, but it was something. It was more fixed than sharecropping. It gave the family an address, a place. Clyde grew up in this, and Clyde responded to his circumstances in the opposite way from Bonnie. Where Bonnie turned outward, bright, loud, performative, reaching toward a fantasy of fame and escape, Clyde turned inward, then turned angry. The poverty shamed him. This is one of the most important things to understand about Clyde Barrow. He was not a man who had made peace with where he came from. He was ashamed of it with a deep, searing, consuming shame. He was short, 5 feet 7 inches, thin and sensitive about it. He came from nothing and he knew people could tell and he hated that they could tell. But there was another side to Clyde that often gets lost in the narrative of him as simply a violent criminal. He was musical. He played the guitar and the saxophone with genuine talent, the kind of talent that his sister-in-law Blanche remembered decades later as something that could fill a room, something that could change the atmosphere when Clyde picked up an instrument. He loved music deeply. He loved cars with an almost physical passion, the speed, the power, the feeling of movement and freedom that a car represented to a boy who had spent his childhood stuck in poverty. He was charming when he wanted to be. He could talk to people, make them laugh, make them feel like he was genuinely interested in them. And he was smart. Not book smart in the way Bonnie was. Clyde had very little formal education, had dropped out of school young to help support the family. But street smart, mechanically gifted, the kind of smart that figures out how engines work and how people work and how to navigate difficult situations. In a different world, Clyde Barrow might have been a mechanic. He was extraordinarily good with cars, not just at driving them, though he became one of the most skilled drivers in Texas, but at understanding them, fixing them, knowing exactly what they could do. But the anger was always there. The anger at poverty, at authority, at a world that had given his family nothing and then blamed them for having nothing. The anger that expresses itself in young men from desperate circumstances as petty crime, as resistance to any structure that smells of control, as a deep and abiding hatred of anyone in a position of power over him. The first arrest came in 1926 when Clyde was 17. Car theft. He stole a car not to sell it, not even necessarily to keep it, but because he wanted to drive it. Because driving felt like freedom. Because when he was behind the wheel of a car he had stolen, moving fast through Dallas streets, he was not the son of a sharecropper living under a bridge. He was just moving. He was just fast and free. The arrest brought a short sentence, county jail, nothing serious in terms of consequences but significant as the first step onto a path. Between 1926 and 1930, Clyde was arrested multiple times. Burglary, car theft, the standard crimes of a young man who had decided that the legal routes to having things were too slow and too closed off to him. He did short stretches in county jail, came out, went back. Building a record. Building a reputation in West Dallas as someone headed nowhere good. His family, Cumie especially, his mother, who loved him fiercely and who spent years trying to pull him back from the edge he was walking toward, worried. But Clyde had already decided something. He had decided that the life that had been given to him was not acceptable. He was going to have more. He didn't know exactly how, but he was going to have more. Then came January 1930, and this is where Clyde's story truly splits into before and after. He was arrested in January 1930 for multiple burglaries and car thefts. This time the judge was not lenient. This time Clyde Barrow, age 20, was sentenced to 14 years at the Eastham Prison Farm. 14 years. He would be 34 years old when he got out, if he kept his nose clean and didn't add time. His whole young life, his 20s, his early 30s, gone. Now I need you to really understand what Eastham Prison Farm was. Because understanding Eastham is understanding the transformation that turned Clyde Barrow from a petty car thief into a man who would shoot police officers in the back without hesitation. Eastham was not a prison in the modern sense. There were no cells in the way you imagine them. Eastham was a working farm, a large agricultural operation in the East Texas wilderness, staffed by prisoners who worked the fields, cotton, sugarcane, whatever the land would produce, from before dawn until after dark, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. The work was physically brutal. Texas heat in summer is not a metaphor. It is a physical presence, a weight that presses down on you. The prisoners worked in it without adequate water, without adequate food, without rest. Guards on horseback carrying guns and whips supervised the work. Prisoners who slowed down, who collapsed, who failed to meet their quotas were beaten. Not disciplined, beaten. There was a specific instrument called the bat, a leather strap, thick and heavy, that guards used to punish inmates. Solitary confinement, hard labor with chains. The system at Eastham was designed not to rehabilitate but to extract maximum labor from human bodies before those bodies broke down. Texas prisons of the era were, by the standards of any civilized analysis, torture facilities. Systematic, state-sanctioned torture facilities disguised as correctional institutions. And then there was something worse. Something that happened to Clyde Barrow at Eastham that his family knew about and that FBI files reference obliquely and that Jeff Gwynn's research confirmed. Clyde was sexually assaulted by another inmate, a man who had a reputation for predatory violence and who targeted younger, smaller prisoners. Clyde was 20, small, not yet hardened. He was victimized, and then he fought back. Clyde Barrow picked up a pipe or whatever was at hand, the accounts vary slightly, and beat his attacker to death. This killing was, according to the research, covered up by prison administration. No formal charges were ever brought against Clyde for it. The death was buried in the bureaucratic silence that surrounded violence in Texas prisons of the era, where inmate deaths were not always carefully investigated. But it happened, and it changed Clyde in ways that could never be undone. He had killed a man. He had killed a man with his bare hands, essentially in an act of violent self-defense that was also objectively murder. And the institution that was supposed to be punishing him for his crimes had not only allowed the conditions that produced this killing but had covered it up afterward. What does that teach a young man? What lesson does a 20-year-old take from being violated in state custody and then killing his violator with a prison guard's implicit approval? The lesson Clyde took was clear. Violence works. Violence is the language that gets understood. The law protects no one, it certainly hadn't protected him. The only protection was the willingness to hurt people before they hurt you. When Clyde's mother Kumi begged the governor of Texas for her son's release, going to Austin herself in person, the act of a woman who had nothing but her own will and her love for her son, she was successful. In February 1932, Clyde was paroled. He had served 2 years of his 14-year sentence. Someone had arranged a job offer, the minimum requirement for parole. He was free. He was also, in every way that mattered psychologically, destroyed. The young man who walked out of Eastham in February 1932 was not the young man who had walked in 2 years earlier. He was not even similar to that young man. The car thief who loved music and dreamed of having enough money to stop being ashamed, that person was gone. What remained was something harder and colder and more dangerous. A man with a genuine talent for violence and a pathological hatred of authority, of police, of any institution that had the power to put him back in a cage. A man who had made a private vow, absolute and irrevocable, that he would never return to prison. Never, no matter what. If they came for him, he would die first. He meant it. He meant it completely. He was not posturing. He was 22 years old. He went back to West Dallas, and he found Bonnie Parker waiting for him. Before we bring Bonnie and Clyde together, we need to talk about something that is absolutely central to this story and that the 1967 movie handles only as backdrop, as atmosphere, as setting. The Great Depression. Because without the Depression, none of this makes sense. Without the Depression, Bonnie and Clyde are just two troubled young people from a bad neighborhood, and maybe they find their way out and maybe they don't, but they're not a national phenomenon. The Depression is not set dressing in this story. It is a character. The stock market crashed in October 1929. In the months that followed, and then in the years that followed, the American economy collapsed in a way that has no real modern equivalent, because we live in a world where mechanisms exist to prevent the worst outcomes, mechanisms that were created specifically because of what happened in the 1930s. In the 1930s, those mechanisms did not exist. Banks failed. Not some banks. Thousands of banks. People who had saved their whole lives, who had worked and sacrificed and put money away for their futures, woke up one morning to find that the bank where their money was kept had simply ceased to exist and their money was gone. All of it. Gone. Businesses closed. Factories shut down. By 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States was approximately 25%. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. In some cities, some industries, it was higher, much higher. Men who had been skilled, employed, respectable middle-class workers were standing in bread lines. Farmers who had owned their land for generations were losing it to foreclosure because they could not pay their mortgages. Families were being evicted from their homes and were living in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, in a gesture of bitter irony, made of scrap metal and cardboard on the edges of cities. In this context of universal desperation, universal uncertainty, a world where the legitimate economic system had demonstrably failed everyone, the people who were already poor, already at the bottom, already living in West Dallas and places like it, were not just struggling. They were fighting for survival. The margins that had always been thin became razor sharp. The difference between eating and not eating, between keeping a roof and sleeping outside, shrank to nothing. Texas was hit particularly hard. The state was already poor in many of its rural and semi-urban areas. The Depression layered additional devastation on top of existing hardship. Banks that small-town Texas families had trusted with their savings failed. Farms that had been marginal became impossible. The prices of agricultural commodities, cotton, wheat, corn, collapsed. A farmer who had been barely keeping his head above water found himself suddenly, completely underwater. And here is where the politics of Bonnie and Clyde becomes important, not because they were political, they absolutely were not, but because of how the public responded to them. In 1932, 1933, 1934, there was a widespread, deep, genuine fury at banks, at law enforcement as an instrument of economic power, at the entire system that had produced the Depression and then seemed incapable of addressing it. When banks were being robbed, and they were being robbed constantly in this era, by Bonnie and Clyde and by John Dillinger and by Pretty Boy Floyd and by dozens of others, some portion of the public cheered. Not because they approved of violence, but because the bank had taken their money. The bank had foreclosed on their neighbor's farm. The bank had destroyed their father's business. And here was some wild young person with a gun, taking from the bank. Even if they kept every penny, even if they killed people to get it, the authorities who chased Bonnie and Clyde were, in the public imagination of the early 1930s, often seen as agents of an oppressive system. This was not entirely fair to individual officers, many of whom were just working men doing a dangerous job. But it was the emotional reality of the era. This context doesn't excuse anything Bonnie and Clyde did. It explains why the public responded to them the way they did. It explains why 20,000 people came to see their bodies. Some of those people came out of morbid curiosity. But some of them came because Bonnie and Clyde had been, for a brief time, symbols of something. Of refusing to accept the life that poverty had assigned you. Of running from the system. Of going out on your own terms. The reality, of course, was that they were murderers who lived in filth and died in agony. But symbols don't require reality. Symbols only require narrative. January 1930. West Dallas, a neighborhood that has produced too many stories like this one. Bonnie Parker was 19 years old, working as a waitress, legally married to Roy Thornton, who was in state prison, living back at her mother's house, bored and lonely and electric with frustrated ambition. She was invited to a friend's house, a mutual friend, a neighborhood girl, on a January afternoon. It was a casual social visit, nothing remarkable about it except that Clyde Barrow happened to be there. The exact details of their first meeting have been softened and romanticized by years of retelling, but the bones of it are simple. Bonnie walked in. Clyde was in the room. They noticed each other. He was charming when he was performing normality, when he was being the person he could be in relaxed social situations. Clyde was genuinely charming. He had presence. He was funny. He knew how to make a girl feel like she was the most interesting person in the room. He had access to cars, which in West Dallas in 1930 was not a small thing. Cars represented freedom, mobility, possibility. He seemed exciting and a little dangerous in the specific way that seemed exciting and dangerous to a 19-year-old woman who had spent most of her life inside the borders of poverty and disappointment. And Bonnie was exactly the kind of woman Clyde had never had access to. Pretty, yes, but more than pretty. Vivid, funny, quick. She made him laugh. She wasn't intimidated by him. She looked at him like he was worth looking at, and Clyde Barrow, who carried the shame of his background like a physical weight, responded to that like a plant responds to sunlight. The attraction was immediate and genuine and this is important, probably the most real thing either of them had felt in some time. Bonnie was lonely. Clyde was fresh from multiple arrests, living at his parents' gas station, going nowhere fast. They recognized something in each other. Both of them were desperately poor. Both of them had an enormous appetite for something different, something more, something that their circumstances made almost impossible to imagine. Both of them had a quality of intensity, a way of being present that most people around them lacked, or had beaten out of them by circumstances. They had 3 weeks together. 3 weeks of Clyde showing up in stolen cars and taking Bonnie driving, fast driving, the kind that made your heart race and your stomach drop and made West Dallas disappear behind you in a blur. 3 weeks of sitting on the porch of the Barrow family gas station and talking for hours about everything and nothing. 3 weeks of Bonnie feeling, for the first time in a long time, like her life might be going somewhere interesting. And then, in February 1930, Clyde was arrested again. Burglary, car theft, multiple charges. This time, the judge gave him 14 years. He was going to Eastham Prison Farm. Bonnie was devastated. She had found something, or thought she had found something, and now it was being taken away. But here is the critical moment, the moment where Bonnie Parker's life diverges from whatever other path it might have taken. She could have let it go. She could have processed the loss and moved on and met someone else and maybe found a different kind of life. She was 19. She was pretty and smart and funny and capable. The options were not great. This was Depression-era Dallas, and she was a poor girl with no education and a criminal husband. But they existed. She chose Clyde. She chose to wait for him. She wrote him letters constantly the whole 2 years he was at Eastham. She visited when visitors were permitted. She maintained the connection across the gap of prison, across the physical distance and the horror of what she must have known was happening to him inside that farm, even if she didn't know the specific details of the assault and the killing. She chose him. This choice, freely made out of love or loneliness or desperation or some combustible combination of all three, is the hinge point of her life. Everything that follows flows from this decision. When Clyde was paroled in February 1932, Bonnie was waiting. Clyde Barrow came out of Eastham Prison Farm in February 1932 as a different person. We've already talked about what prison did to him, the violence, the assault, the hardening. But it's important to sit with what that transformation looked like from the outside, what Bonnie encountered when he came back. He was physically changed. He'd lost weight. He moved differently, with a coiled watchfulness, an alertness that never fully relaxed, the body language of a man who had learned to be constantly ready for threat. His eyes were different. People who knew him before and saw him after Eastham consistently remarked on the change in his eyes. Something had gone out of them, some quality of openness or youth, and what was left was harder and flatter and more careful. He was quick to anger in a way he hadn't been before. Small things could set him off. The wrong look, the wrong tone, anything that felt like disrespect or challenge. And he had a plan. The plan was simple and terrible. He was going to take money. He was never going to be poor again, and he was never going back to prison, and the only way he knew how to accomplish both of those things simultaneously was through robbery. He had no other skills, or thought he didn't. He had no education, no connections, no path through legitimate channels. What he had was a willingness to do violence, a hatred of authority, and a talent for driving cars. These were the ingredients of a criminal. Bonnie wanted to go with him. This is the part that surprises people. The assumption is that Bonnie was dragged into the criminal life, coerced, manipulated. The reality is more complicated. Bonnie chose it. Not the murders, probably. She didn't sign up for murder. She didn't know that was where they were going. But the crime, the running, the life outside normal boundaries? Part of her wanted it. Part of her, the part that had always wanted more than West Dallas waitressing could give her. The part that wrote dramatic poetry about fate and early death. The part that had always felt like she was meant for something that regular life couldn't provide. That part was pulled toward the Clyde who had come back from prison. Not despite the danger, but partly because of it. Clyde initially said no. He told Bonnie it was too dangerous. He was going to do this alone or with other men. She should stay home, stay safe. And Bonnie, stubborn, determined, deeply attached to this man and to the idea of their life together, refused to accept that. She argued. She persisted. She made clear that she was coming, or she would find a way to make herself come, and eventually Clyde gave in. Not because he thought she was right, but because she was immovable, and because having her with him meant having the one person in his life who saw him as something other than a criminal and a piece of trash. They started in the spring of 1932. Small robberies, the absolute bottom of the criminal food chain, convenience stores, gas stations, small grocery stores in small Texas towns. The takes were pathetically small. $20, $50, sometimes a little more. They drove around in a stolen car, always stolen cars, because buying a car required an identity and a fixed address and money, none of which they had in reliable supply, and they would pick a target, walk in with a gun, take the cash from the register, and run. It was not glamorous. It was not even particularly well organized. It was desperate people improvising crime, and if you look at the actual details of these early robberies, the targets, the amounts, the methods, what you see is not a criminal enterprise, not a gang operation. What you see is two young people who have no plan beyond making enough money to eat for another week and put fuel in the car they've stolen. The first murder happened in April 1932, and with it, everything changed. The town of Hillsboro, Texas. Population small, economy depressed, exactly the kind of small Texas town that dotted the landscape of the early 1930s. A few businesses on a main street, a courthouse, farms spreading out in every direction, people who knew each other by name and had known each other their whole lives. John Bucher was 60 years old. He ran a grocery store. He was, by every account available, an ordinary man, not rich, not powerful, not connected to the banks or the institutions that the public associated with the causes of the Depression. He was a small business owner in a small town during a terrible economic time, and he probably worried constantly about whether he was going to make it through the year. He had a wife. He had a life. He had $28 in his register. Clyde Barrow walked into that store with a gun. The details are documented in the FBI files, in witness testimony, in the basic factual record of what happened. John Bucher did not simply hand over the money. Whether out of defiance or panic, or the specific courage of a man who had worked hard for everything he owned and was not going to hand it to a stranger, he resisted. He tried to fight back, or tried to reach for something, or simply refused to comply fast enough, and Clyde Barrow shot him. Killed him. For $28. This is the moment. This is the moment where the Bonnie and Clyde story transforms from a story about desperate poor kids making terrible choices into something darker. Because there is no way back from this. Before this moment, Clyde Barrow was a car thief who had committed violence in prison, arguably in self-defense, however you want to interpret the Eastham killing. After this moment, he was something else. He was a man who had murdered an innocent person for $28 in the exercise of a robbery. He was legally and morally a murderer. And in Texas in 1932, murder was a capital crime. The electric chair. Death. Clyde knew this. He fled the scene, and he knew, riding away in the stolen car, that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. There was no turning himself in, no pleading down the charges, no cooperating with authorities. If they caught him now, they would kill him. The vow he had made leaving Eastham, that he would never go back, that he would die before they put him back in a cage, now had a specific, concrete meaning. Because going back now didn't mean 14 years of farm labor. Going back now meant the electric chair. And Bonnie was present for this. She was in or near the car. She knew what had happened. She knew a man was dead. And she had to make the same calculation that Clyde had already made. She could leave. She could walk away. She could turn herself in and tell authorities everything and cooperate and probably receive some kind of consideration given her limited direct involvement in the actual killing. She could go back to her mother's house and her waitress job and the long, slow suffocation of West Dallas poverty. She stayed. She chose to stay. And with that choice, she sealed her fate. "I know that Clyde's end is coming soon," she wrote, or words to that effect, in the poetry and letters of the period. She knew. She accepted it. There is something almost incomprehensible about this. A 21-year-old woman accepting her own death as a given, as a condition of a life she has chosen. But that is what the evidence shows. Bonnie Parker, in the spring and summer of 1932, knew she was going to die young. She wrote about it. She made peace with it. And she stayed. By the summer of 1932, the operation that would become known as the Barrow Gang had taken shape. And here I want to be very specific, because the Hollywood version of the gang, the sophisticated criminal enterprise, the coordinated operations, the romantic outlaw band, is almost entirely fiction. The Barrow Gang was usually 3 to 5 people. It changed composition constantly. People came and went, sometimes because they were arrested, sometimes because they couldn't take the life, sometimes because Clyde decided they were a liability. The core was Clyde and Bonnie. Around them orbited various other young men from the West Dallas criminal milieu who were willing, for various reasons and for various lengths of time, to attach themselves to a murderer and a robbery spree. Clyde's older brother, Buck Barrow, joined them in early 1933, along with his wife Blanche. Buck was several years older than Clyde. He'd been in and out of trouble his whole life, had done prison time, had recently been released. He adored his younger brother. Blanche, his wife, is one of the most important witnesses to this story because she wrote a memoir, My Life with Bonnie and Clyde, that was published decades after the events it describes, and that remains one of the most valuable primary sources for understanding what daily life with the Barrow Gang was actually like. Blanche was not a criminal. She was a young woman who followed her husband because she loved him and because leaving him would have felt like abandonment. She hated the life. She was terrified constantly. She cried a lot. She was the one member of the extended group who never really accepted the world they were living in as anything other than a nightmare she was trapped in. And the life, as Blanche described it, was a nightmare. Let's be specific about this, because specificity is what destroys the romantic myth. They lived in cars. Stolen cars, changed every few days because Clyde was paranoid, correctly paranoid, about being traced through license plates and vehicle descriptions. They would steal a car, drive it for a few days, abandon it somewhere, steal another one. The cars were not comfortable. This was the early 1930s, and cars of that era were not air-conditioned or particularly well-sprung or designed for extended habitation. They were hot in summer and cold in winter and cramped always. The Barrow Gang slept in these cars, multiple people, folded and contorted, getting a few hours of poor sleep before dawn, when they had to move again. They ate cold food. Canned beans, canned sardines, bologna, crackers. Whatever could be purchased quickly and cheaply and consumed without cooking, because cooking meant a fire, and a fire meant smoke, and smoke meant visibility. Even the simple human pleasure of a hot meal was denied to them for most of their 2 years on the run. Blanche wrote about how much she craved hot food, how the cold canned beans began to feel like a physical punishment. Hygiene was a luxury. They bathed when they could, when they found a creek or river isolated enough to use without risk, or when they could afford to rent a tourist cabin for a night, or when they were visiting family, which was risky, desperately risky, but which they did anyway because they were human beings who needed to see their mothers. Witnesses who encountered Bonnie and Clyde in various contexts, farmers who helped them, people who were briefly taken hostage, the gang kidnapped people periodically, then released them, gas station attendants consistently mentioned the smell. Not as a judgment, but as a fact. They smelled. They smelled the way people smell when they have been living in a car for weeks without proper access to bathing facilities. They smelled the way poverty smells when poverty is compressed into a mobile tin box on wheels. This was the reality that the 1967 movie couldn't show you. Not because it was trying to lie, necessarily, but because these things are simply not cinematic. You can't smell a movie. You can't feel the specific misery of waking up in a car for the 40th morning in a row, stiff and cold, your neck at a wrong angle, eating cold beans from a can while you scan the horizon for police cars. You can't convey on film the grinding, exhausting, unrelenting fear of a life on the run, the way every car that slows down near you makes your heart rate spike, the way every stranger's face might be a face that recognizes yours, the way you never fully sleep because your nervous system is always at a low level of alert that never fully shuts off. And all of this, the cold food, the stolen cars, the poor sleep, the constant fear, the rare bathing, the life compressed to survival, all of this while committing murder, while watching men die, while living with the knowledge that when the end came, it would be violent. Bonnie knew. She wrote about it in her poetry. Someday they'll go down together, she wrote in what became her most famous poem, the one the newspapers published after her death. Someday they'll go down together. She was not being dramatic. She was being accurate. Let's go through 1933 in detail, because 1933 was the bloodiest year, the year when the Barrow Gang's violence escalated from opportunistic to systematic, when Clyde Barrow's cop killing became a defining characteristic of who he was and how he operated. But before we get to the specific murders, let's establish the broader context of what this life looked like on a daily basis, because the specific murders, as terrible as they are, exist within a context of ongoing, low-level misery that shaped everything. By early 1933, the core group was Clyde, Bonnie, Buck Barrow, and Blanche. They were moving in a circuit, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, because no state had a comprehensive enough law enforcement network in 1933 to effectively pursue criminals across state lines. The FBI, then called the Bureau of Investigation, was just beginning to develop its capability to operate nationally, and in 1933 that capability was limited. State police and county sheriffs were responsible for their own jurisdictions and coordinated badly, if at all, with other states. This is one of the reasons Bonnie and Clyde evaded capture for as long as they did. They were constantly moving across boundaries that law enforcement found difficult to cross. The circuit they traveled was not random. It was shaped by two things: family and operational opportunity. Operational opportunity meant, where can we rob without immediately encountering a massive law enforcement response? This pointed them toward small towns, toward isolated rural areas, toward places where the law was thin on the ground and communications slow. Family meant, where are the people we need to see? Because both Bonnie and Clyde were deeply, almost painfully attached to their families. Clyde visited his parents' gas station when he could. Bonnie tried to see her mother. These visits were risky. Law enforcement knew about the families, watched them, tried to use them as bait, but they kept happening because neither Bonnie nor Clyde could sustain the complete isolation that pure self-preservation would have demanded. They needed their families, not just emotionally, though the emotional need was real and intense, but practically. The families provided food, provided information about whether law enforcement was watching, provided brief sanctuary. Emma Parker and Cumi Barrow were both, in various ways, accessories to their children's crimes. Not because they approved of what their children were doing, both mothers were deeply unhappy about it, but because when your child shows up at your door and they're hungry and scared and you love them, you feed them. You don't turn them in. You feed them. This detail, that the families kept the connection, kept providing support even as they understood what their children were doing, is one of the most humanizing elements of the entire story. And it's one of the things that Frank Hamer eventually used against them. The new year was less than a week old. West Dallas, January 6, 1933. Clyde Barrow was visiting family, his brother's house, or in the vicinity of the family neighborhood, attempting one of those risky homecoming moments that he could never quite resist. A stolen car had been spotted. Someone had reported something suspicious. Deputy Sheriff Malcolm Davis responded to a report in the neighborhood. He was a lawman doing his job. He had a family. He had a wife and children who were depending on him to come home that evening. He approached what he believed to be a suspicious vehicle. Clyde Barrow shot him. Deputy Malcolm Davis died. He was not the first person the Barrow gang had killed, but he was the first law enforcement officer killed in 1933, and in some ways he represented a new phase of the killing. Because Clyde Barrow's hatred of law enforcement, his specific, personal, consuming hatred that came from Eastham, from the violence of the prison system, from the accumulated rage of every arrest and every beating and every year spent in the system, had by now moved beyond the situational violence of a criminal trying to escape. It had become something more like a policy. When cornered, when approached by police, Clyde Barrow's default response was to shoot. Not to try to escape, not to talk his way out, not to surrender. To shoot. Deputy Davis's death left behind a wife and children who would spend decades living with what happened on January 6, 1933. By April 1933, the gang had made it to Joplin, Missouri. They had rented an apartment there, or rather, they had rented a garage apartment at 3347 and 1/2 Oak Ridge Drive, a two-story structure above a garage that gave them a fixed base for a few days of relative rest, relative normalcy. The kind of place where you could sleep in an actual bed, eat something hot, feel briefly like a human being instead of an animal on the run. Law enforcement had received a tip. Neighbors had noticed something, people coming and going at odd hours, strangers, unusual activity. The tip made its way to police. A decision was made to investigate. Two officers, Constable Wes Harriman and Detective Harry McGinnis, were assigned to check out the suspicious apartment. They approached with other officers. What happened next was documented and reported extensively at the time and is drawn from the official records that were preserved. The gang was inside. They had been tipped off or had heard the cars arriving or simply had the paranoid alertness of people who lived constantly on the edge of discovery. Weapons were ready. When the officers approached, gunfire erupted. Wes Harriman was killed. Harry McGinnis was killed. Two men, two lawmen, two people doing their jobs, dead in the parking area outside an apartment in Joplin, Missouri on April 13, 1933. The gang fled. They escaped in their car in a chaotic running gunfight that left both sides damaged and shaken. But they left something behind. Camera. A roll of film. And when police developed that film, the story of Bonnie and Clyde changed forever. The photographs on that film were, by the standards of 1930s American crime, extraordinary. They were taken by the gang members themselves, impromptu, playful, the kind of photos that young people take when they are together and feeling invincible. Bonnie Parker, 22 years old, posing with a cigar stuck jauntily in the corner of her mouth and a pistol in her hand, squinting at the camera with theatrical toughness. Bonnie and Clyde together, leaning against a car, armed, playing at being exactly what they were. Clyde grinning, holding weapons, looking young and dangerous and almost, in a specific, deeply ironic way, happy. The newspapers published these photographs. Every paper in the country ran them. And what the photographs did was something that neither Bonnie nor Clyde could have planned, could have anticipated, could have engineered. They made them famous. Not infamous, famous. The photographs were exciting. They were vivid. They had a strange charisma, a youth and energy that translated even through grainy newsprint reproduction. They looked like characters in an adventure story. They looked like people having the most interesting, most dangerous, most alive time anyone was having in Depression-era America. Bonnie Parker, who had wanted all her life to be famous, who had dreamed of being an actress, who had written poetry because she wanted to leave something behind, who had felt invisible and trapped in West Dallas for her whole life, Bonnie Parker was famous. Her face was in every newspaper in the country. There is something almost unbearably sad about this. She got her wish. She got the fame she had always wanted. And it came packaged with dead men and a burning car and a stolen life that was getting shorter every day. One note that needs to be corrected immediately, because it became one of the most persistent myths of the Bonnie and Clyde legend. Bonnie Parker did not smoke cigars. The photo was a joke, a pose, a bit of theater. She smoked cigarettes. The cigar was a prop, a bit of outlaw drag. But the image was printed and reprinted, and the cigar-smoking gun mall became part of the legend, and it stuck, and it was completely false. June 1933, near Wellington, Texas. Night driving. Clyde Barrow was an extraordinary driver, genuinely gifted behind the wheel, capable of handling cars at speeds and in conditions that would have wrecked most people. But he was also, like all human beings, capable of error. And on a night in June 1933, he made an error that Bonnie Parker would carry in her body until the moment she died. There was a bridge, a road bridge over a ravine or creek, and in the dark, Clyde often drove without headlights to avoid detection. There was a sign, a warning sign about road conditions or a detour or some change in the road surface ahead. He missed it. The car went off the bridge. What happened in those seconds of impact and the aftermath is documented in multiple accounts. Blanche Barrow's memoir, witness testimony from the farming family that helped them, the subsequent medical treatment records insofar as any existed. The car tumbled. It caught fire, the battery acid from the car battery igniting, setting fire to the interior. And Bonnie Parker was trapped. Her legs were pinned in the burning car. The battery acid and the flames covered her right leg from the hip down to the ankle. Third-degree burns. The worst possible category of burn. Damage not just to the skin but to the underlying tissue, to the muscle itself. The kind of burn that, with proper medical care in a hospital with trained burn specialists, requires months of intensive treatment and often leaves permanent damage even with the best available care. Bonnie did not get proper medical care. She could not go to a hospital. A hospital meant doctors, and doctors meant records, and records meant the police would be notified that Bonnie Parker was there with severe burns from a car accident. They could not risk it, so they stopped at a farmhouse near the crash site. They relied on the charity of farming families who were, like most farming families of the era, decent people who helped when someone was hurt, even someone who might be a criminal. Bonnie was carried to the house screaming. She was given whatever pain relief was available, morphine, probably, which the gang always carried, and her leg was wrapped in makeshift bandages. And then, after a few days, they had to move again. Because police were looking. Because they were always looking. You couldn't stay anywhere. You couldn't rest. You couldn't let Bonnie's leg heal properly because healing required rest and rest required staying still, and staying still meant being caught. The wound never healed properly. How could it? She was living in a car. The bandages were not changed often enough. The wound got infected. Repeatedly. The infection was controlled but never cured. There was no adequate treatment available. By the fall of 1933, Bonnie Parker's right leg was a permanent, chronic wound that caused her constant pain and left her unable to walk without a pronounced limp. She could not put full weight on the leg. Clyde carried her, literally carried her, lifted her small body and carried her, whenever she needed to move quickly. The 1967 movie mentions the car crash briefly. Faye Dunaway is shown as injured, but Faye Dunaway still looks beautiful, still moves with grace, still presents as a vital and attractive young woman. The reality was that Bonnie Parker, in the last year of her life, was a 23-year-old woman who was malnourished, chronically infected, and in constant physical pain. Photographs from this period, photographs that exist, that are in the historical record, show a dramatic difference from the earlier photos. She looks thin and drawn. She looks exhausted. She looks like someone who is running on determination alone, with all the cushion of health and youth gone. This is who Bonnie Parker was when she died. Not Faye Dunaway, not a beautiful woman in a beret with a gun. A tiny, injured, exhausted 23-year-old in chronic pain who had long since accepted that she was going to die soon and had chosen to die beside Clyde rather than separate herself from the only life she knew how to live anymore. The Joplin killings in April 1933 were not the end. The killing continued throughout 1933 and into 1934, and each new death added to the roster of victims who are largely forgotten in the romantic retelling of the Bonnie and Clyde story, but who were real people with real families who grieved them. In July 1933, at a place called Platte City, Missouri, the gang rented a tourist cabin and was surrounded by law enforcement. In the firefight that followed, Buck Barrow, Clyde's brother, was shot in the head. He didn't die immediately. He lingered for days, in agony, his skull fractured, his brain damaged, unable to speak coherently. Blanche was with him. She watched him die over the course of days, begging anyone who would listen to help him, holding his hand, terrified and grief-stricken and absolutely certain that she herself was going to die too. Buck Barrow finally died from his wounds on July 29, 1933. Blanche was arrested. She was tried, convicted of assault, and served time in prison. She was, by every account, not a murderer and not a willing participant in the gang's crimes. She was a woman who had followed her husband and paid a devastating price for it. And the gang, now just Clyde, Bonnie, and a young man named W.D. Jones who had joined them, kept moving. In November 1933, a young man named Henry Methvin joined the gang. He was from Louisiana, from a family in Bienville Parish, and he would eventually become the instrument of Bonnie and Clyde's deaths. But in the fall of 1933, he was just another young man from a poor background who had latched onto Clyde Barrow's operation for reasons that probably included fear, excitement, and the specific gravity that violent charismatic men can have over less certain people. January 16, 1934. This date is significant not just for another killing, but for what the killing represented. Clyde Barrow, working with several accomplices, organized a prison break at Eastham Prison Farm. The same Eastham that had destroyed him. He smuggled guns to prisoners inside the farm. The logistics of this are impressive in a grim way, and on January 16th, a group of prisoners used those guns to escape. In the escape, a prison guard named Major Joseph Crowson was shot. He died from his wounds the next day. This was personal for Clyde. This was not simply a robbery, not simply a crime of opportunity. This was Clyde Barrow returning to the institution that had assaulted him, that had tortured him, that had broken something in him that could never be repaired, and striking back at it. Major Crowson's death was not incidental to this. It was the kind of cost that Clyde would have accepted, probably welcomed, as part of hurting the institution he hated. An innocent guard paid with his life for what the Texas prison system had done to a young man years earlier. The injustice of this, the specific injustice of it, is staggering. Crowson had nothing to do with what happened to Clyde. He was a prison employee doing a job. He died because Clyde Barrow needed to punish something. The Eastham break enraged Texas authorities. It was one thing for Bonnie and Clyde to be robbing stores and gas stations in Oklahoma. It was another thing for them to be actively undermining the prison system, attacking the state's ability to maintain order, helping convicted criminals escape, killing a guard. The political pressure on Texas law enforcement to end the Barrow gang became intense. And then came Easter Sunday, 1934. Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934. Near Grapevine, Texas, on a rural highway. It was morning. The light was the specific clear light of a Texas spring morning, the kind of morning that is objectively beautiful regardless of what is about to happen in it. Two young highway patrolmen were on duty. Their names were E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy. Wheeler was 26 years old. Murphy was 22, barely more than a kid, recently married, relatively new to the job. They noticed a car parked by the side of the road. Two people inside. The car was not moving. In the logic of routine patrol, you stop. You check. You make sure everything is okay. They pulled over. What happened next is documented in multiple accounts and FBI records. Clyde Barrow, or Clyde and Henry Methvin together, the exact sequence has been disputed, opened fire on the officers as they approached the vehicle. Both patrolmen were killed. Murphy was shot multiple times. Wheeler was shot as well. One of them, the accounts vary on which one, was shot in the back as he tried to run, or as he fell, or as he was already dying. A witness reported that one of the officers said, "Don't," before being shot again, begged for his life. They were murdered on Easter Sunday morning. Both of them, young men doing their jobs. Wheeler, 26, had been an officer for several years. Murphy, 22, was so new that some accounts say it may have been one of his first days on active patrol. He had been married only months before. His wife was waiting for him to come home. The Easter Sunday murders changed public opinion dramatically. Up to this point, there had been a contingent of the public, particularly in rural Texas and Oklahoma, in the places most ravaged by the Depression, who viewed the Barrow Gang with at least ambivalence, if not quiet sympathy. The rebel outlaw narrative had traction, but there was nothing romantic about what happened on that highway on Easter Sunday morning. 2 young cops killed, one of them apparently begging for mercy. Shot in the back. On Easter Sunday, the public turned. Newspapers that had been covering the Barrow Gang with an edge of excitement, those Joplin photos, the chase, the escapes, the mythology, shifted tone. The calls for their deaths became louder and less conflicted. The sympathy that had existed, fragile and inconsistent as it was, largely evaporated. 5 days later, on April 6, 1934, the gang killed again. Constable William Campbell, 64 years old, was shot and killed near Miami, Oklahoma. An elderly lawman, approaching a suspicious vehicle, killed. Another family bereaved. Another name added to the roster of the dead. By April 1934, the count was climbing past a dozen. At least 13 people dead, 9 of them law enforcement officers. It had been 2 years. 2 years of stolen cars and cold beans and constant movement and murders. 2 years of Bonnie's leg getting worse and her body getting thinner and the poetry about dying young becoming more and more specific. 2 years of Clyde driving faster and shooting sooner and sleeping lighter and trusting fewer people. They were exhausted. The evidence suggests this clearly. The photographs from this period show it. They were not romantic outlaws in the prime of their power. They were worn down, injured, traumatized young people at the end of something. In February 1934, as the body count continued to rise and the Texas prison break demonstrated that the Barrow Gang was not simply evading capture but actively attacking state institutions, the decision was made to bring in someone specific. Someone with a specific reputation, specific skills, specific methods. Frank Hamer was 50 years old in 1934. He had been a Texas Ranger for more than 30 years, and his career was the stuff of genuine legend, not the manufactured legend of dime novels and movie posters, but the kind of legend that accumulates around a man who has done extraordinary things in an extraordinary context. Hamer had killed criminals in gunfights over the course of his career. The exact number is disputed, and we should be careful about treating death as a simple metric of achievement, but the number is significant and real. He had survived multiple attempts on his own life. He was described by contemporaries as patient, methodical, physically brave to a degree that bordered on something else, and possessed of a hunter's intuition for anticipating where his quarry would move. He had retired from active duty. He was brought back specifically for Bonnie and Clyde, hired through the office of the Texas governor, given the mandate to end the Barrow Gang. He accepted. By his own account, he accepted partly because the Easter Sunday murders, young officers killed without mercy, offended him in a specific personal way. He had been a police officer his whole career. Clyde Barrow killed police officers. This was, for Frank Hamer, not just a law enforcement problem. It was something more personal. His method was different from what had been tried before. The previous approach to catching Bonnie and Clyde had been reactive, waiting for them to surface somewhere, then trying to respond. But they were too fast and too mobile and too willing to use violence for a reactive response to work. By the time officers arrived anywhere, Bonnie and Clyde were already gone, already in another state, already in another stolen car. Hamer's approach was anticipatory. He studied them, not from a distance, not from reports and radio bulletins. He traveled to every place they had been. He interviewed people who had encountered them. He looked at the geography of their movements over 2 years, Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and he looked for the pattern underneath the apparent randomness. Because there was a pattern. There is always a pattern when someone is being pulled by the twin forces of operational necessity and emotional need. The pattern Hamer found was this: they circled. They moved through the same states, the same regions over and over. They were drawn back to Texas by family, to West Dallas, to the Barrow family gas station, to Emma Parker's house. They were drawn back because they were human beings who loved their families and could not sustain complete isolation no matter how dangerous the contact was. The family visits were their vulnerability. And there was something else. Henry Methvin, the young man from Louisiana who had joined the gang in late 1933. Methvin's family was from Bienville Parish, Louisiana, and Hamer had learned, through careful investigation, that the gang had been using the Methvin family property in Louisiana as an occasional base, as a place of relative safety in a state where they were somewhat less immediately known than in Texas. Hamer made a deal. He approached Henry Methvin's father, Ivan Methvin, a man who understood very well what his son had gotten himself into and who wanted, desperately, for his son to survive it. The deal was essentially this: cooperate in setting a trap for Bonnie and Clyde, and your son will receive leniency from the state. Ivan Methvin agreed. His son's life against the lives of two murderers. He agreed. By May 1934, Hamer had assembled his team. 6 officers total: Frank Hamer himself, Texas Ranger Manny Galt, Henderson Jordan, the sheriff of Bienville Parish, his deputy Prentice Oakley, and 2 other Texas officers named Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton. Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton were from Dallas County. They had actually known Bonnie and Clyde personally, from before the criminal period, from the West Dallas neighborhood. They could identify them by sight without hesitation. This was considered important. The location was chosen carefully. Highway 154, a rural back road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, near a tiny community called Sales. It was the road that Bonnie and Clyde would need to travel to reach the Methvin family property. It was isolated, farmland on both sides, scrub brush and trees, the kind of Louisiana backcountry road where you could hide 6 men with automatic weapons in the vegetation and have no one notice. They scouted it. They found a spot where the sight lines were good, where the road curved in a way that slowed approaching traffic, where the brush was dense enough for concealment. And they set up an additional piece of staging. Ivan Methvin's truck, a recognizable vehicle that Bonnie and Clyde would associate with someone they knew, someone they trusted, was placed by the side of the road with a wheel removed, as if it had broken down. The plan was that Bonnie and Clyde, seeing Ivan Methvin's truck apparently disabled by the roadside, would slow down or stop to check on him. Ivan himself was to be visible, not threatening, just a familiar figure with a broken-down truck. The posse camped in the area for days, waiting. Days in the Louisiana heat, in the brush, watching the road. They slept rough, ate what they brought, kept their weapons ready. They did not know exactly when the moment would come. They only knew it would come because the Methvin property was where the gang was heading, and this was the road they would take. The weapons they had brought were not standard police issue. They had Browning automatic rifles, bars, military-grade automatic weapons capable of firing a .30 caliber round at a rate that would be devastating at close range. They had shotguns. They had pistols. They had, between 6 of them, an enormous amount of firepower and an enormous amount of ammunition. This was not a capture operation. This was always going to be a kill operation. Hamer knew, and everyone else knew, that Clyde Barrow would not stop when asked to stop. He would reach for a gun. He had done it every time. He had vowed to do it every time. And they were prepared for it. The morning of May 23, 1934 began the way most mornings begin, which is to say without announcement, without ceremony, with just the ordinary fact of the sun rising on Louisiana farmland. What was Bonnie doing that morning? What was Clyde doing? The historical record doesn't give us their specific thoughts or feelings, but we know some things. We know they were probably tired. They were always tired. We know Bonnie's leg was hurting. It always hurt. We know they had been staying somewhere in the area, probably at or near the Methvin property, the relative safety of a familiar location. We know Clyde was driving. He always drove. We know Bonnie was beside him. She was always beside him. There's a detail that's in some accounts and that I want to mention because it's the kind of detail that makes you feel the reality of these two people. They had stopped at a store or somewhere nearby that morning and gotten food. Bonnie had requested something specific. Some accounts say it was a sandwich, a hot sandwich, something better than the usual cold-canned food. A small human desire, a small pleasure. She was eating it when the car reached Highway 154. At approximately 9:10 a.m., Ivan Methvin removed the wheel from his truck and left it by the roadside as planned. The 6 officers settled into their positions in the brush on both sides of the road. Weapons loaded. Safeties off. Silence except for the sounds of Louisiana countryside in late May, birds, wind, insects. At 9:15 a.m., a tan Ford the 5th came around the bend. Clyde Barrow was driving. Bonnie Parker was in the passenger seat beside him. Both were in the car. Clyde saw the truck. He slowed. Ivan Methvin's truck, broken down by the roadside. He recognized it. He slowed down. What happened next took approximately 15 to 20 seconds. The accounts vary slightly on whether Hamer gave a verbal warning, whether he stepped out of the brush before the shooting started, or whether the firing began immediately. The accounts agree that what followed was an essentially continuous discharge of firepower from 6 officers with automatic weapons, shotguns, and pistols, all aimed at a car with 2 people in it who had absolutely no warning, no cover, no chance. 130 bullets at minimum. Some accounts put the number higher. Fired in 15 to 20 seconds. Bonnie Parker was hit 26 times. Clyde Barrow was hit at least 25 times. The car was riddled. The windows were gone. The doors were torn. The interior was destroyed. Both of them were dead, probably in the first seconds, hit by multiple rounds, killed before they could have understood fully what was happening. The gunfire stopped. Silence. The sound of birds again, eventually, and then the careful footsteps of 6 men approaching a car that they had just filled with bullets. Clyde Barrow was 25 years old. He was slumped over the steering wheel with more than 25 bullet wounds in his body. He had driven fast cars, played guitar and saxophone, hated being poor with every cell in his body, killed police officers, survived Eastham Prison Farm, loved his family, made every choice that led him to this road. He was 25 years old. Bonnie Parker was 23 years old. She was beside him in the passenger seat with 26 bullet wounds in her small body, and her leg still wrapped in its old infected bandages and whatever she had been eating that morning in her hands. She had wanted to be famous. She had wanted to escape West Dallas. She had written poetry that knew this was coming. She was 23 years old. The scene that the officers encountered after the shooting stopped was, by every account, deeply disturbing even to hardened lawmen. The interior of the car was destroyed. Blood was extensive. The bodies, so small, both of them, really, were slumped in their seats in the ruin of what had been their mobile home for 2 years. Their entire world had been this car. Stolen cars, always moving, always running. This was the last one. The officers found, in and around the car, an arsenal. Multiple rifles, multiple pistols, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Clyde had been armed and prepared, as he always was. It had not mattered. News spread within hours via telegraph and telephone, across Texas and Louisiana and then across the country. The Barrow gang was finished. Bonnie and Clyde were dead. The public reaction was immediate, massive, and complicated. Arcadia, Louisiana. The bodies were taken to a furniture store, Conger's Furniture, which had a back room that could serve as a temporary morgue while arrangements were made. And the town of Arcadia, which had a population of a few thousand, was suddenly swamped with people. 20,000 people. This is the figure that historians and contemporaneous newspaper accounts settle on, with the understanding that exact crowd estimation in 1934 was not precise science. But the number, whatever it was staggering for a small Louisiana town with no warning, no preparation, and no infrastructure for this kind of event. People arrived from all directions. By car, by wagon, on foot. People who had read about Bonnie and Clyde in the newspapers. People who had seen those photographs from Joplin. People who had followed the 2-year chase through wire service bulletins and radio reports. People who wanted, and this is the most human and the most disturbing thing, to see. And some of them wanted more than to see. The crowd that pressed around the furniture store where the bodies were being held included people who tried to cut locks of Bonnie Parker's hair as souvenirs. Someone made an attempt to cut off Clyde Barrow's ear. The undertakers and the officers guarding the premises had to physically protect the bodies from a crowd that had, in the specific mass hysteria of spectacle, briefly lost its collective mind. It was grotesque. It was a specific kind of American grotesque that has not entirely disappeared, the merging of celebrity and death, the impulse to possess some fragment of something famous and terrible. The undertaker, a man named C.F. Bailey in some accounts, later described the difficulty of preparing the bodies for viewing, given the extent of the damage. 26 bullet wounds in Bonnie's tiny body. At least 25 in Clyde's. The mortuary work required to make the bodies presentable for the funerals that followed was significant. Both autopsies confirmed what was already obvious: multiple fatal wounds in both victims, death instantaneous or near instantaneous. The autopsies also confirmed what the people who had been following them closely already knew. Both were malnourished. Both were in poor physical health beyond the obvious cause of death. Bonnie's right leg showed the old burn injury, partially healed and partially infected, the chronic wound of a year of living without proper medical care. Both of their bodies told the story of 2 years on the run in a language of physical damage and deprivation. Bonnie Parker had asked to be buried with Clyde. She had said this in letters, in conversations, in the very explicit way that people say things they believe are going to be important. She wanted to be with him in death as she had been with him in life. She wanted them to be together. The Barrow family said no. Whatever tension existed between Bonnie's family and Clyde's family, whatever complicated feelings the Barrows had about the years of danger that Bonnie's presence in Clyde's life had represented, whatever the reasons, Cumi Barrow and the rest of Clyde's family refused to bury them together. They were kept apart in death, separated. In some final, bitter irony, the couple who had chosen each other so completely that they died together on a Louisiana road were denied the burial they had requested, the last thing either of them had wanted. Bonnie Parker was buried at Fishtrap Cemetery in Dallas. Her mother, Emma Parker, was there, devastated, grieving, trying to reconcile, as she would try to reconcile for the rest of her life, the little girl who had written poetry and dreamed of being famous with the young woman who had become a murderer's accomplice and died in a hail of bullets at 23 years old. 20,000 people, by most estimates, came to the funeral or gathered nearby. People climbed trees to see. People crowded onto rooftops. The spectacle continued. Emma Parker would live until 1944. She would spend those years dealing with the aftermath, the shame, the grief, the ongoing fascination that the public had with her daughter, the way that fascination never quite acknowledged the real human cost on the families left behind. Clyde Barrow was buried at Western Heights Cemetery, also in Dallas. His family gathered, his parents, his siblings, the family that had tried to hold him back and couldn't. Cumi Barrow, his mother, who had walked to the governor's office to beg for his life and had gotten 2 more years of time before the end came anyway. She would die in 1942. She never spoke publicly about her son without love, and she never pretended that what he had done was acceptable, and she lived with both of those truths simultaneously for the rest of her life. The families were left behind. The families always get left behind. The victims' families, who spent decades living with what Bonnie and Clyde had done to their loved ones. The Barrow family and the Parker family, who spent decades living with what their children had become. The families don't appear in the 1967 movie. They exist in the shadows of every telling of this story, paying costs that no one ever fully accounts for. Frank Hamer lived until 1955. He was 71 years old when he died of natural causes in Austin, Texas. His career continued after the ambush. He remained a figure of significant reputation in Texas law enforcement circles, though the ambush also generated controversy, then and later, about whether the killing of Bonnie and Clyde without a genuine attempt to capture them constituted extrajudicial execution. Hamer himself had no visible regrets. He had been hired to stop 2 cop killers. He had done it, and his view of the ethics was clear. The victims of the Barrow gang had no opportunity to survive their encounters with Clyde. He saw no obligation to provide opportunities that had not been extended to the people Clyde murdered. This argument about whether the ambush was justified or whether it was a summary execution was made during the era and continues to be made. It is a genuine ethical question, but it exists in tension with the very real fact that Clyde Barrow had demonstrated, repeatedly and definitively, that when approached by law enforcement he would shoot. Hamer and the other officers had to make a calculation. The risk of attempting a capture versus the certainty of violence if the capture attempt failed. They made the call they made. Henry Methvin, the gang member whose family had cooperated in setting the trap, received the leniency he had been promised, at least initially. He was eventually sentenced to prison on other charges, served time, and was released. He died in 1948, in a railroad accident in Louisiana, killed by a train while apparently lying on the tracks. Whether accidental or otherwise, accounts differ. Blanche Barrow, Buck's wife, the woman who had watched her husband die and had spent every moment with the gang, hating every moment of it, was arrested, tried, served time in Missouri for assault charges related to the Joplin shootout, and was eventually released. She lived a long life, dying in 1988 at the age of 77. She spent decades trying to correct the historical record, particularly her portrayal in the 1967 movie, where she was depicted in a way she found both inaccurate and unflattering. She gave interviews. She was a witness, one of the last living direct witnesses, to what the Barrow Gang's daily life was actually like. Her memoir remains invaluable. The death car, the bullet-riddled Ford the 5th 8 in which Bonnie and Clyde died, was purchased by a carnival promoter and toured as an attraction. People paid to see it. People reached through the windows to touch the bullet holes. It was exhibited for years, traveling from fair to fair, state to state, a piece of American morbidness on wheels. It currently resides in a casino museum in Primm, Nevada, where you can still see the bullet holes if you visit. Over 100 of them. Bonnie and Clyde, released in 1967, was directed by Arthur Penn. It starred Warren Beatty as Clyde Barrow and Faye Dunaway as Bonnie Parker, and from the moment it was released it was understood to be something significant, a departure, a new kind of American film, something that was drawing on the French New Wave and on the specific cultural upheaval of the late 1960s to tell a story about rebellion and violence in America in a way that American cinema had not quite managed before. It was violent. For 1967, it was shockingly, graphically, almost confrontationally violent. It had a specific energy, restless, kinetic, sexy, doomed. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 2. For Best Supporting Actress, Estelle Parsons, and Best Cinematography, Burnett Guffey. It is, as a piece of cinema, genuinely excellent. I want to be clear about this because this video is not a film criticism video and my goal is not to tear down a good movie. Bonnie and Clyde is good cinema. It is well directed, beautifully shot, excellently acted, and it captures something real about the mood of its own era, the late 1960s, Vietnam, civil rights, the sense that institutional America was failing its people and that rebellion against it was not just understandable but necessary and even noble. The film works as a film of its time. It earned its Oscars. It earned its place in the film school curriculum. What it also did, as a side effect of its excellence as a piece of cinema, is construct a myth about two real people that has proven extraordinarily durable and extraordinarily disconnected from reality. And because the film is so good, because it is so emotionally compelling and so beautifully made, the myth has survived everything that should have dislodged it. The declassified FBI files didn't dislodge it. The scholarly biographies didn't dislodge it. The victim testimony and the autopsy reports and the contemporaneous newspaper coverage didn't dislodge it. The myth persisted and persists because a beautiful movie told a beautiful story and human beings are creatures who respond to beautiful stories. So let's go through it. What did the movie get right? What did it get wrong? And why does it matter? The Depression setting. The film places its characters in the context of the Great Depression with genuine authenticity, the poverty, the unemployment, the foreclosed farms, the dust and the desperation and the specific quality of the 1930s American landscape. This is accurate. The Depression is not just backdrop in the movie. It's presented as a genuine causal factor, as the soil in which Bonnie and Clyde grew. The famous scene where Bonnie and Clyde encounter a displaced farm family, the men who have lost their land to the bank, and Clyde gives one of the farmers a gun and tells him to shoot at what was his. This scene is fictional, it did not happen, but it captures something emotionally true about the era and about how the public perceived the Barrow Gang. It's a myth of the myth, but it resonates. The small-time robberies. The movie is accurate that Bonnie and Clyde were not major bank robbers. They robbed small stores, gas stations, small-town banks that were easy targets. The film doesn't inflate their criminal achievements into something more organized or sophisticated than they were. The robberies in the film are often chaotic, often go wrong, often net very little money. This is accurate. The Barrow Gang was not the hole-in-the-wall gang. They were not sophisticated criminals with elaborate plans. They were desperate young people improvising crime. The violence. The 1967 film was famous, and at the time infamous, for its graphic violence. The final ambush sequence, with its slow-motion bodies jerking from bullet impacts, was controversial enough to prompt serious discussion about what violence in cinema should look like. But the film's violence, graphic as it was for 1967, is actually not an exaggeration of the real violence of the Barrow Gang story. The real violence was worse. The real ambush was 130 bullets in 15 to 20 seconds, 2 people dead before they could respond. The real murders committed by the gang were ugly, close range, often against people who were trying to run or begging for mercy. The film's violence is, if anything, somewhat aestheticized compared to the reality. The fact that they were a couple. They were, in fact, a couple. This is one of the things the movie gets simply right. Bonnie and Clyde were genuinely, deeply complicated but real partners in both the criminal and emotional sense. They were together from 1930 until they died in 1934. Whatever the complexity of the relationship, whatever the questions about the physical side of it, whatever the codependency and the dysfunction, they chose each other. They stayed together. They died together. The family connections. The film shows Clyde's family, the Barrow family, his mother, his brother Buck, as active participants in sheltering and supporting the gang. This is accurate. The Barrows provided food, information, refuge. The film is right that these family connections were both a human necessity and an operational vulnerability. The youth. The movie shows Bonnie and Clyde as young, as vitally, recklessly young, as people who have not fully processed the consequences of what they're doing because they are too young and too alive to really believe in consequences yet. This is emotionally true, even if the actors were older than the real people they played. The real Bonnie and Clyde were young in a way that is almost impossible to fully absorb. 23 and 25. They were kids. The glamour. This is the biggest and most consequential thing the movie gets wrong. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway are extraordinarily beautiful people. They were extraordinarily beautiful people in 1967, and they remain extraordinarily beautiful people in the film today. They wear perfectly chosen 1930s costumes. Faye Dunaway's beret and midi skirts and cardigans became a genuine fashion phenomenon when the movie was released, influencing clothing design and sales across America. They are clean. They are stylish. Their hair is perfect. Their skin is perfect. Bonnie Parker in the movie is the kind of woman who looks attractive even when she's supposed to be roughing it. The real Bonnie Parker, in the last year of her life, was malnourished and chronically infected and in constant pain and wearing the same clothes for weeks at a time and had not had a proper bath in more time than you want to think about. The real Clyde Barrow smelled. Witnesses said they smelled. Blanche Barrow said they smelled. This is not judgment. It's the physical reality of living in a car without regular access to bathing facilities. It's the reality of poverty on the run. But it is not cinematic. You cannot smell a movie. And so the movie gave you beautiful people in beautiful clothes and the smell was left out. And with the smell went much of the miserable, grinding, degrading reality of their actual lives. The romance. The movie presents Bonnie and Clyde as a grand romantic love story. A doomed but passionate partnership. The film spends considerable time on the emotional and physical relationship between them, on the tenderness alongside the violence, on the specific tragedy of two people who love each other and who are running out of time together. This is the version of the story that people carry with them. This is what makes Bonnie and Clyde romantic. The reality is substantially different. Their relationship was real. They were together. They cared about each other. The bond was genuine. But it was not the sweeping romance of the film. It was codependent, entangled, marked by the specific dynamics of two deeply traumatized young people who needed each other in ways that were not entirely healthy. The question of the physical relationship is, frankly, complicated and sensitive, but the evidence, letters, accounts from people who knew them, the specific injury Clyde sustained at Eastham that likely caused impotence, suggests that it was not the passionate physical romance the film implies. They were emotionally intimate. They were partners. But the romantic framing flattens something complex and sad into something beautiful. Clyde's characterization. Warren Beatty plays Clyde Barrow as a charming, conflicted, complicated man who is capable of genuine sweetness alongside genuine violence. He gives Clyde a humanity, a likability, a quality of sympathetic vulnerability. He is, in Beatty's hands, a man you root for even as he does terrible things. This is excellent acting, and it is also, when measured against the historical record, a significant falsification. The real Clyde Barrow shot law enforcement officers in the back. He shot people who were running away, people who had surrendered, people who posed no immediate threat. He killed a 60-year-old man for $28. He shot 2 young highway patrolmen on Easter Sunday morning, and according to witness testimony, at least one of them begged for his life before being shot. The 1967 film cannot quite bring itself to show you this Clyde. The film's Clyde kills people, yes, but in ways that feel like the violence of a cornered man, a frightened man, a man who is more reactive than predatory. The historical Clyde was predatory. When he shot police officers, he was not simply defending himself from overwhelming force. He had decided that he would kill any law enforcement officer who approached him. It was a policy decision, not a reflexive response. The Robin Hood myth, or rather, the movie's careful ambiguity about it. The film never explicitly states that Bonnie and Clyde are Robin Hood figures who give to the poor, but it creates the impression through careful framing and the Depression context, the scene with the displaced farmer, the way the Barrow Gang is shown in contrast with callous authority figures, that they are somehow on the right side of a moral equation. This impression is false. They gave nothing to anyone. They kept every cent. They robbed people as poor as themselves. The moral equation was not complicated. They were murderers who stole small amounts of money and killed people who got in their way. Bonnie's agency and role. The film presents Bonnie as an active, engaged partner in the criminal enterprise, shooting guns, making decisions, shaping the direction of the operation. Faye Dunaway's Bonnie is a full participant, not a passive presence. This is partially true and partially false. Bonnie was present for everything. She was, by the legal definition, an accomplice to everything. But the evidence suggests that the shooting, the planning, the decision-making, that was Clyde. Bonnie drove sometimes. There's no strong evidence that she shot and killed anyone, though there's no certainty either. Most of the testimony suggests she was primarily a witness to and passenger in the criminal operation rather than an active shooter. The film made her more active, more decisive, more equal in the partnership than the evidence supports. Bonnie's physical condition. Faye Dunaway as Bonnie Parker remains beautiful throughout the entire film. Even after the car accident. Even in the final ambush. She is thin and perhaps slightly drawn in the later scenes, but she is still Faye Dunaway. Still striking, still vital, still every inch a movie star. The real Bonnie Parker's leg never healed. She limped. She was carried. She was visibly, significantly damaged by the accident that happened in June 1933. The photographs from the last year of her life show a dramatic change from the vivid, healthy-looking young woman of the early photographs. She looks exhausted. She looks ill. She looks like someone who has been living in a car in chronic pain for over a year. The film couldn't show you this because it would have broken the romantic spell completely. The ambush itself. The film's final ambush sequence is famous for its ballet of violence, slow motion, operatic, gorgeous in the specific way that only cinematic violence can be gorgeous. Bonnie and Clyde see it coming in the film. There's a moment, a shared look, a recognition between them that this is the end, an almost peaceful acceptance, before the bullets begin. It is one of the great endings in American cinema. It is beautifully shot and beautifully acted, and it is essentially completely false about the actual experience. The real ambush took 15 to 20 seconds. There was no moment of recognition. There was no shared look. If Hamer did shout a warning, and accounts vary on this, there was no time for any response other than a reflexive reach for a weapon. They were dead almost immediately. The beauty of the movie's ending is entirely fabricated. The real ending was an explosion of gunfire in 15 seconds on a Louisiana back road. Quick, brutal, and over. The body count. The film shows some killings but handles the body count in a way that significantly underrepresents the actual deaths. The real Barrow Gang killed at least 13 people. 9 of them were law enforcement officers. The film focuses on a smaller number, handled in a way that maintains our sympathy for the protagonists. The victims in the film are mostly present as obstacles or as symbols of corrupt authority, not as fully realized human beings with families who would grieve them. The film cannot tell both stories, the story of the outlaws and the full story of their victims, and so it chooses the outlaws. The age. Warren Beatty was 30 years old when he played Clyde Barrow. Faye Dunaway was 26 when she played Bonnie Parker. The real Clyde was 20 when they met and 25 when he died. The real Bonnie was 19 when they met and 23 when she died. This matters more than it might seem. The specific tragedy of the real story is partly a tragedy of extreme youth. These were barely adults, people who had not had time to accumulate the perspective and the experience that might have allowed them to make different choices. The 1,967 actors were adults, mature adults with fully formed faces and the body language of people in their late 20s and early 30s. The real outlaws were kids. This is something the film fundamentally cannot convey by casting adults. What the movie simply could not show, and why it matters. There are things the 1967 film literally couldn't show because they're not visual. The smell, the cold food from cans, the specific misery of waking up in a car for the 100th morning in a row with a stiff neck and Bonnie's leg infected, and the paranoia of not knowing if this was the day. The poverty, not the Depression-era poverty of the movie, which has a certain sepia-toned aesthetic quality, but the specific, grinding, degrading poverty of people who have been living as fugitives for 2 years and are physically broken by it. The guilt, if there was guilt, we don't know for certain what Bonnie felt about the people who died. But she wrote about death constantly, and it's hard to believe she felt nothing. The longing for her mother, the homesickness, the knowledge that the end was coming. The 1967 film is a great movie made about two young murderers that, by being great, created a myth that has obscured the reality of those two young murderers for 60 years. That's not an indictment of the filmmakers. Arthur Penn was a serious and talented director who was making a film about America in 1967 as much as he was making a film about 1934. But it's the truth. The movie lied to you. It lied beautifully, skillfully, memorably, with 2 Oscars and decades of cultural influence. But it lied. I want to spend a moment, and this doesn't appear in the 1967 movie, not really, not enough, on the people who died. The 13 or more people who were killed by Bonnie and Clyde and their associates between 1932 and 1934. Because the romantic myth, whether it comes from the movie or from the Depression-era newspaper coverage or from the century of storytelling that followed, tends to make the victims almost invisible. They become background noise. They become the cost of the narrative rather than the center of it. John Bucher was 60 years old. He had a grocery store in Hillsboro, Texas. He was killed for $28. He had a wife who survived him. He was a real person. Malcolm Davis was a sheriff's deputy in West Dallas. He had a wife and children. He was killed doing his job, approaching a suspicious vehicle, because Clyde Barrow's response to law enforcement was always to shoot. Wes Harriman was a constable in Joplin, Missouri. Harry McGinnis was a detective. They were killed in the raid on the Joplin apartment, killed because the gang was cornered and chose violence. Both had families. Both had people who loved them. E.B. Wheeler was 26 years old. H.D. Murphy was 22. Both were highway patrolmen. Both were killed on Easter Sunday morning, 1934. Murphy had been married only months before. He was new to the job, beginning his career, building a life. He was 22 years old when he was shot to death approaching a parked car on a Texas highway. His death was not exciting. His death was not part of a romantic outlaw story. His death was a young man being murdered at the start of his life. These people deserve to be remembered. Not instead of the Bonnie and Clyde story. The history is the history, and understanding it requires understanding all of it. But alongside it, as the reason that whatever sympathy we might feel for the circumstances that produced Bonnie and Clyde, and those circumstances were genuinely terrible, cannot extend to excusing what they did. Context is not absolution. Understanding is not forgiveness. So what do we do with all of this? 2 kids from the slums of West Dallas. This is where it starts and it is where it ends, because the beginning is always the meaning. Bonnie Parker, born October 1st, 1910, in Rowena, Texas. Father died when she was 4. Moved to the slums. Smart girl. Talented girl. Wanted desperately to be something, to be someone, to escape the poverty that pressed down on everything from the time she was old enough to understand poverty. Wrote poetry that was actually good, actually had merit, actually showed a mind that deserved more opportunity than it got. Married wrong at 15. Worked as a waitress. Lonely and bored and electric with frustrated ambition. Clyde Barrow, born March 24, 1909, in Tellico, Texas. Sharecropper's son. Moved constantly. Slept in tents under wagons in shacks under bridges. Ashamed of everything he came from. talented with cars, with music, with the specific kind of intelligence that doesn't come from books. Arrested in his teens. Sent to Eastham Prison Farm at 20. Assaulted there. Killed a man there. Came out at 22 with a vow and a capacity for violence and a hatred of authority that went all the way down. They met in January 1930. They saw in each other something they recognized, the same desperation, the same hunger, the same refusal to accept the life that poverty had assigned them. They chose each other in that specific, reckless, codependent way that two very young people choose each other when they are running from something and toward nothing in particular. They chose crime because they didn't know another way. This is not an excuse, it's an explanation, and the distinction matters. There were other people from West Dallas who grew up in the same conditions and didn't murder 13 people. The choices Bonnie and Clyde made were their choices. They were made by people with the capacity for choice. The poverty and the trauma and the depression context are real factors, but they don't eliminate the agency that produced those choices. Bonnie and Clyde are not simply victims of their circumstances. They are also the authors of their own story, including its darkest chapters. They killed at least 13 people over approximately 2 years. 9 of them were law enforcement officers doing their jobs. Some were shot in the back. At least one begged for his life. A 60-year-old grocer was killed for $28. 2 young highway patrolmen were murdered on Easter Sunday morning. The killing was real. The blood was real. The grief of the victims' families was real and is real and will always be real regardless of how many movies romanticize the people who produced it. They lived in filth and pain and constant fear. This is not romanticization of a different kind, not the romantic suffering of poets and rebels. This is the specific, unglamorous physical reality of life on the run. Cold beans from cans. Stolen cars changed every few days. Rarely bathing. Bonnie's leg rotting slowly from the inside because she couldn't get proper medical care and she couldn't stop moving long enough to let it heal. Both of them malnourished, exhausted, aging faster than they should have been because bodies don't survive 2 years of this. Their story was not exciting. It was miserable. Bonnie knew it was going to end the way it did. She wrote about it. Someday they'll go down together. They'll bury them side by side. She was 22 years old when she wrote those lines, and she was right, and she stayed anyway. What does that tell us about her? It tells us that she was either braver or more broken or more codependent than we have the language to fully describe. Probably all three. She had made her choice in 1930, and she honored it with her life. Frank Hamer found them because he was patient and thorough, and because Henry Methvin's father made a calculation about his son's survival. On May 23, 1934, on Highway 154 in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, 6 men with automatic weapons ended it in 15 to 20 seconds. 130 bullets. Bonnie Parker was 23. Clyde Barrow was 25. They were dead before the sound of the gunfire fully faded. 20,000 people came to see their bodies. People tried to cut off Bonnie's hair, Clyde's ear. The death car went on tour. A few years later, a movie made them beautiful and romantic and gave them Warren Beatty's face and Faye Dunaway's cheekbones and turned their tawdry, violent, miserable story into one of the great American myths. And that myth has been more durable than the truth. The myth is more durable than the truth almost always. But the truth is what it is. 2 kids, 2 sets of grieving parents, 13 dead people with families who never got their grief into a movie. 2 young people who made terrible choices and paid the price and left behind nothing except a bullet-riddled car in a Nevada casino and a myth that has outlasted everyone who actually knew them. They weren't heroes. They weren't Robin Hood. They weren't glamorous. They weren't romantic. They were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, and they were 23 and 25 years old, and they died on a back road in Louisiana in a car full of bullet holes, and that's the truth. I want to end with something that isn't about glamour or myth or Hollywood. I want to end with the question of why we keep telling this story. Why, 90 years after the fact, there are still books and movies and documentaries and videos like this one about 2 poor kids from West Dallas who robbed gas stations and killed people. Part of the answer is the obvious part. It's a dramatic story, it has compelling characters, it has the structure of a chase narrative and a love story and a tragedy all at once. It has photographs. The Joplin photographs gave us faces, and human beings respond to faces. The story has a beginning and a middle and a very definite end. But I think there's something deeper. I think the story of Bonnie and Clyde endures because it touches something uncomfortable about the relationship between poverty and violence, between the failure of economic systems and the choices that failure produces in people, between the myth of the self-made individual and the reality of what circumstances do to people before they ever have a chance to make themselves. The Depression created a specific kind of desperation in the early 1930s that we associate with an era, but that kind of desperation, the kind that comes from having nothing and seeing no legitimate route to having something, is not confined to any era. It's always somewhere. It's always producing people who make terrible choices in response to terrible conditions. This doesn't excuse anything. I want to be absolutely clear about that because I've spent nearly 3 hours documenting a body count, and the people in that body count deserve clarity about what happened to them and why. The choice to rob and kill is a moral failure, full stop, regardless of the conditions that produced it. But understanding the conditions matters. Understanding them is how we avoid producing more of them. Understanding them is how we look at the 23-year-old in chronic pain in the passenger seat of a stolen car and see both the choices she made and the world that made her. Bonnie Parker wanted to be famous. She wrote poetry about it, dreamed about it, told anyone who would listen about it. She wanted to leave something behind that said she had been here, that she had mattered, that her small, difficult life had been worth something. She got famous, just not the way she imagined. The 1967 movie gave her Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway and a myth that spans 6 decades. The truth gives her something harder, a 23-year-old woman in a bullet-riddled car, a mother who grieved her for the rest of her life, a leg that never healed, and poetry that actually was good, actually was worth reading, actually showed a mind that deserved a different world to grow up in. This has been the complete, documented, sourced, real story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Not the myth, the truth. If you watched all of this, all 3 hours, then you now know the real story of Bonnie and Clyde in more depth and with more accuracy than probably 99% of people who know their names. That's worth something. That matters. Drop a comment right now. What shocked you most in this video? Was it the poverty, the cold beans from cans, the living in stolen cars, the thing that the movie completely glossed over? Was it the body count, 13 people, 9 of them cops, and some of them begging for their lives? Was it Bonnie's leg, the third-degree burns that never healed, the infected wound she carried for the last 18 months of her life? Was it how young they were, 23 and 25 years old, kids, barely adults? Was it the 20,000 people who came to see the bodies and tried to cut off Bonnie's hair as souvenirs? Tell me. I read every comment. I respond to a lot of them. This conversation matters to me. If you want to go deeper, and I strongly recommend it, go read Jeff Gwynn's Go Down Together, the true, untold story of Bonnie and Clyde. It is the definitive work on this subject, and it is excellent. Read Blanche Barrow's memoir for the first-hand account of what daily life with the gang was actually like. Read Emma Parker's 1934 account if you can find it, because a mother's grief is always a different kind of truth. The FBI files are available online through the FBI Vault. They are extensive, they are detailed, and reading primary sources on something like this is a different experience from reading secondary summaries. Share this video. Share it with anyone who loves the 1967 movie. Share it with anyone who thinks Bonnie and Clyde were romantic heroes. Share it with history teachers. Share it with true crime fans. Share it with anyone who has ever posted a Bonnie and Clyde quote on their social media like it was something aspirational. The truth is more interesting than the myth. The truth is always more interesting than the myth. Subscribe because I'm going to keep doing this. This is my format. I take a famous crime movie, I go to the primary sources, I spend a month doing the research, and I tell you what actually happened. We did Escobar. We did Serpico. We did Dillinger. We did Scarface. And we're going to keep going because the history is always richer, always darker, always more human and more complicated than Hollywood gives it credit for being. Like this video right now. One like from you costs you nothing. For this channel, it is everything. It tells YouTube's algorithm that this kind of deep, researched, honest content deserves to be seen. If you watch 3 hours of this and you learn something real about real people who really lived and really died, the least valuable thing you can do to show that it mattered is hit the like button. Please do that. One last thing. I want to read you something that Bonnie Parker wrote in the poem that was found among her belongings and published in newspapers after her death. I'm going to paraphrase it rather than quote it directly, because it's her work and her copyright, but the meaning is clear and the meaning matters. She wrote about knowing how the story was going to end. She wrote about dying young. She wrote about the two of them going down together. She wrote it at 22 years old, sitting in a stolen car, eating cold food, with her leg in bandages, and she wrote it with genuine literary craft and genuine emotional truth. She knew. She always knew. And she stayed anyway. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway played glamorous outlaws who died in slow motion with perfect hair and perfect clothes and the aesthetic weight of Hollywood tragedy behind them. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were 23 and 25 years old, living in stolen cars, eating cold beans, covered in road dust and old blood and the specific grime of 2 years on the run, and they died in 15 seconds on a back road in Louisiana with 130 bullets between them. The movie lied to you. I showed you the truth. That's what I'm here for. See you in the next one.